So we're going to hear about Edward Bellamy's Religion of Solidarity. And I think you've all seen the picture of Edward. Of course, he is a very well-known figure, obviously strongly influenced by American transcendentalists such as Emerson and Thoreau and others who were, I think, remarkable. And truly, the teachings of Asia, which were sorted in the 7th century plan from Tsongkhapa, came through to someone like Bellamy. Now, it's not known if, at least I don't know if he was formally a theosophist, but he has all the theosophical ideas in his essay and work. And this essay we're going to talk about was written when he was only 24. So it's the work of a very passionate young man. And we're even going to talk about sex a little today, which theosophists often don't get to talk about. So I thought you might all enjoy that, being mature people. Well, first of all, just a little bit about his life. He was a man who didn't live a long life, only 48 years. He lived during the time HPB was on the planet and William Q. Judge. Although I have no knowledge if he ever met them. He spent most of his life in New England. He was born in Chicopee, Massachusetts. And his father was a Baptist preacher. So he obviously comes from a background which was not as broadly based as a theosophical one. He did study law, got a law degree, never practiced, but he wanted to be a journalist and writer. He did spend over a year in Europe, especially in Germany, and he studied Fabian socialism in England. And at the age of 32, he married a woman named Emma Augustus Sanderson, who must have been a woman of some intellectual ability, because it's very obvious that he feels that sensuality and spirituality and intellectuality should come together in a relationship. So he wrote, looking backward, let's see, I'm going to have to see my whole screen. I'm going to have to get rid of the right side. How do I do that, Jonathan?
You hover over it. Oh, in terms of getting rid of it. Oh, okay. In
Yeah.
that case, you go to and if anybody really knows how to do this, please jump in. There is a thing called.
Is that a little 4 button?
Do you want to go to the next slide? Is that what you mean when you say get rid of it?
No, the thing is, I can't read the whole text here, but
Okay.
let's see.
Oh, wait a minute.
Hide thumbnail video.
You see it up at the top says view options. At the top, actually.
Okay.
View options. And then
okay.
you could do you could try 100%.
Okay.
Sorry,
okay.
I can't coach you through this. All my smart.
No, that's all right.
Okay.
Okay, that should work then. You don't have to see me. We want to see the text. All right. Well, he wrote a sequel to Looking Backward in 1887, the year before his death, and it was simply called Equality. And I haven't read that sequel. However, the idea of everyone being equal in the sense that the work of a person scrubbing the floor is just as important as the work of a doctor is very important in the idea of looking backward, because everyone contributes to the society and all should be respected. He was an individual of sometimes frail health, but nevertheless, he founded a magazine called The New Nation, and it was a principal publication of the People's Party, which was a political party he started, and it only lasted about 10 years. But the idea of equality, which is, of course, in Fabian socialism, eliminated all social classes, regarding all work as equal in value. If all citizens volunteered to work between 21 to 45, all crime and corruption would be gone. of course, which is something discussed in Looking Backward. And there were a number of nationalist clubs in the US, but they did not survive the Gilded Age in the 1890s. And the most unfortunate thing about Bellamy is that he actually used the term National Socialism. But of course, it didn't mean what National Socialism came to mean in Germany eventually, which was really dreadful. It turned into fascism. He meant by nationalism to care for the whole of the nation more than yourself. And of course, socialism to put some of your wealth as was necessary, as Saint Simon said, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And we'll go on to the next slide. And now, Fabian socialism. What is going on here? Okay, I've got to get. I just want to talk about Fabian socialism for a minute. Really, Fabian socialism was again an extremely idealistic notion, which envisions a system that guarantees every citizen the right to reach his or her potential. And poverty, hunger, homelessness are eliminated. Education is free to all, and a citizen has health care from the cradle to the grave. And we can recognize some of these ideas that are still being implemented in the United States partially or being debated. And he also wrote, this worker is not a citizen because he works, but he works because he's a citizen. And that work is an obligation. Full support is a right. And Bellamy said a socialist revolution would occur in 1992. Well, of course, it didn't. I remember Mike Kiley and I discussed this at the Institute of World Culture. We discussed Looking Backward. Unfortunately, we don't have any such utopia in the United States. In fact, the gap between the richer and the poorer seems to be widening at the moment. Okay, now let's go to the actual essay, The Religion of Solidarity, which I hope, can you all see the text up there?
Yes.
Okay, good. Now I want to share some of his actual prose because it's something that I could never replicate in speech. And you'll find that there's not only sensuality, but spirituality and a great deal of compassion all connected together in it. He says there are times in the experience of most persons of emotional temperament in which this desire, I would almost call it lust, after natural beauty amounts to a veritable orgasm. How often in the brooding warmth and stillness of summer nights, when the senses are oppressed with natural beauty and the perfumed air is laden with voluptuousness solicitations, does the charm of nature grow so intense that it seems almost personal, and under its influence the senses are sublime to an ecstasy. It is then that the most palpable barrier seems to hold back the soul from merging with the being toward which it so naturally tends. Now, this is from the Concord Grove Press Green Book edition. And just a comment on this reminded me very much of Walt Whitman's poetry when Walt Whitman writes summer night, mad, naked summer night. His Whitman, of course, is just absolutely beautiful. And I think it's very clear that Bellamy must have read Whitman because he also combines this sensual interconnection with nature and a feeling of solidarity. And, you know, what could this mean spiritually? Because we're used to thinking of solidarity in terms of social terms, in terms of labor unions or those unjustly attacked, like the Ukraine. But we'll develop this as we develop the essay. So he also says further in the essay, now who can doubt that the human soul has more in common with life of all time and all things, toward which it so narrowly eagerly goes out than with the narrow, isolated, and incommodious individuality, the thrall of time and space to which it is so reluctantly and with such a sense of belittlement and degradation perforce returns. So the human soul in Bellamy's essay clearly has existed for all time, will exist for all time, and is not separate from what human beings call God, not separate from nature. And we've all had mystical experiences, perhaps, in which we have felt at one with nature, and either in a summer night or maybe even in a cold winter afternoon. And yet these experiences don't always last, and they bustle with life. Oh my goodness. I've just got to go back on the text a little bit. This is so sensitive. Okay. All right. I'll get back there. Okay. So he also thinks that all individuals can be possessed of genius. I mean, HPB says this is also in her article called Genius, that really genius is a quality of the soul, which even the person who may appear to be as lowly as the man with a hoe, to go to Edwin Markham, another socialist poem, he hasn't had a chance to ever develop his genius, but perhaps it is there. And so he says it is essentially impersonal in its manifestations. The personality of the subject is in suspense. To be possessed of genius, a man must be unconscious of his personality. He must be beside himself, even as the Delphic priestess was required to be before the oracle spoke through her. We can but conclude then that the unconsciousness of the personality or impersonal consciousness does imply a vague and shadowy mode of being, but rather a stronger, intense pulse of feeling than is obtainable in the most vigorous assertion of personality. Individuality, personality, partiality is segregation, is partition, is confinement, is in fine a prison, and happy are we if its walls grow not wearisome, ere our 70-year sentence expires. So there's a sense in which it's clear that Bellamy feels terribly constrained. There we go again. And now I'll get back to the right text. Okay. So he is also talking, I think I missed this slide, that about the human soul's nature, that it has more in common with the life of all time and all things, toward which it so eagerly goes out, than with the narrow, isolated, and incommodious individuality, the thrall of time and space, to which it so reluctantly, with such a sense of belittlement and degradation, perforce returns. Okay. And then he goes into, of course, the sense of rapture that we feel when we encounter beauty. It can be the beauty of another person, the beauty of music, the beauty of a summer night. In the degree in which we realize beauty of any sort, we approach the impersonal condition and obtain a hint of the mode of the impersonal consciousness. It is only when we say we forget ourselves and in a certain mystic way seem to share the life of the thing admired that we taste the pure and high felicity of a perfect realization of a perfect sense of beauty. It is in this measure that we are wrapped out of ourselves into the mood of impersonal consciousness, that we are sublimed by the impulses of self-devotion and attain the grand experience of enthusiasm. All these are but the activity of our greater self, the impersonal consciousness within us. And so it really is clearly theosophical what he says here, although we don't know if he really understood this in terms of the Atman Buddhi manas of theosophy, the higher self, and the lower quaternary, but he is absolutely certain that there is a greater life of the soul that we are living that are smaller, ordinary conscious life, what the Hindus would call the Jagrat, is not aware of. And of course, he says of the soul that ever rising and falling, ever wavering and undulating, ebbing and flowing as from some eternal reservoir. The wind bloweth where it listeth, and thou hearest the sound thereof, but canst not tell whence it cometh and whither it goeth. So is the soul of man born again in every fresh inbreathing of the soul of solidarity. So here he is connecting the idea of reincarnation with the idea of solidarity, that instead of thinking really of, well, I am such and such an ego in this life, and in the next life, I'm going to be some other personal ego with a name and form, that there is just a natural flow of the soul, which one will eventually become aware of. Okay, and we talk about genius. So he also says about the mystical experience. I'm sorry. What? I don't, this is so sensitive.
Take your time.
Okay. It, this is just so sensitive. I've got to get back down there. Sorry.
Take your time.
Okay. There's a lot to absorb anyway. So, okay. So in regarding the mystical experience, don't think of this in terms of some sort of a physical activity. Ask for no heavens to open or firmament to dissolve, that you may be faced with God and see the end of all things. Steadfastly look into the well of your own life and know the powerlessness of human tongues to express its endless depths, its boundless contents. Ere ye think of any other infinity, fathom and compass that, and be prepared to learn there is but one problem in the universe, and that is the nature of the soul, which is one in you and in all things. At such times we say we have been out of ourselves, but in reality we have been into ourselves. We have only just realized the greater half of our being. We have momentarily lived in the infinite part of our being, a region ever open and waiting for us if we will but frequent its highlands. We call all six experiences abnormal. It should be normal. And of course, with most people, these experiences happen only occasionally, but it would be nice if we could live a life where we would constantly be in this state of connection with our soul nature. Okay, so again, it's very theosophical what he says. A half conscious God is called then to recognize his divine parts. The soul is what it would be. It has the infinity it craves. We restrict ourselves. There are no barriers to the soul, but such a sense-bound fancy imagines when Thales enunciated the maxim, know thyself. That's aphele panta in Greek. He propounded a maxim not to be dissolved, for the human soul is continuous with it. The dual existence of man is at once infinite and infinitesimal in particular. Now, in my understanding, it's actually Socrates that got the uh, know thyself from the Delphic Oracle, but it may be that Thales said that. The only thing that's known to have survived is Thales is that he said it's all is water, but he was one of the pre-Socratic adepts, and he probably had a lot more to say that all is water. So he probably did. I think it's an idea of the ancient mystery schools that you have to, that in knowing yourself, you're going to know God. No, again, is this tendency of the human soul toward a more perfect realization of its solidarity with the universe by the development of its instincts, partly or wholly latent, altogether a theory. I call attention to the fact that the sentimental love of the beautiful and sublime in nature is a comparatively modern and recent growth of the human mind. Well, I just want to discuss this because there were a lot of writings at the time of Bellamy, such as Sartor Resartus by Carlyle, which talks about the symbiotic relationship between man and nature. And there were the writings of Whitman, Thoreau, Emerson's essay on nature. And you don't really find the ancient Greeks and Romans writing so much in the same way. But what I think the reason for this is that the Industrial Revolution had occurred, and poets like William Blake realized how badly the dark satanic mills could damage nature, and poets like Wordsworth realized how much the world was too much with us late and soon. Whereas with the Greeks, they were much more in tune with nature than we are, and went in, for example, for with natural healing. The ancient adept Hippocrates really totally knew what plants would heal and what would kill, for example. So I think that's the reason for that statement, or we can discuss it. And then just to go on with the essay, this instinct towards solidarity of the identity of our lives with all life is the centripetal force which binds together in certain objects all orders of beings. In fine, the instinct of solidarity in the moral universe correlates with the attraction of gravitation in the material world. We should ever interpret the finite in us by the infinite, but the infinite by the finite. Never. For instance, if we interpret love as a partial realization under the hindering conditions of individuality, that complete fusion of souls, which is the centripetal tendency of universal instincts, we sublime our passions so that an experience of the individual life becomes an eloquent revelation of the universal. Personalities cannot absorb each other. Their essence is diversity. And so here again, he touches on the idea that the soul is universal, and it's really basically because of the soul that there is love for each other in the universe, and that it is like a gravitational attraction, and sometimes hatred is like a magnetic repulsion. And there are writers like Dostoevsky who really understood this paradox of human behavior very well. So further on, Bellamy returns to his argument: in losing our personal identity, we become conscious of our universal identity, the identity of universal solidarity, not losable in the universe, for it fills it. And this is the religion of solidarity, or the spirituality of solidarity, rather than the solidarity of a union, an army, or a political party. This is the universal solidarity he wants to get across. And he said it is the operation of this law in a great and low things, and the love of men for women and for each other, and for the race, for nature, and for those great ideas which are the symbols of solidarity, that has ever made up the web of wood of human passion. Love between individuals is the attraction of kindred particles, but the greatest of all loves, at once the most enthusiastic, the most sustaining, insatiable love is that of the individual for his remnant, the universe. This is the love of God, by whatever name men may choose to call it. The manner in which love asserts itself between individuals is illustrative of the law of solidarity. So now he's calling it a law in the same way Theosophists think of brotherhood as a law because it's really rooted in the first fundamental of the secret doctrine that we all come from one source. And now he's starting to wind up the essay with something very interesting. He says, the sexual relation is the greatest example of that physical correlation, which approximating the individualities and relaxing the vigor of their natural attitude of mutual antagonism and exclusiveness affords an opportunity for confluence and at least a partial sympathy in the role of lovers, and the bliss resulting from the consciousness of even this imperfect union is the result of the common essence of souls. But after all, how imperfect is this union, even when helped to the utmost by physical conditions? You find a woman on whose face you never tire gazing, with a desire miraculously filling a full heart fuller. Fortune gives her to your arms, and the fruit of physical satiety has been yours, but is your desire satisfied? It is herself, her soul, her utter life, which you would absorb, into which you would be absorbed, and with which you would be one. Well, of course, he's writing at the time of Havelock Ellis, also, who was one of the first writers who wrote frankly about sex in the Victorian era, who was also a Fabian socialist. And it's very clear that not everyone will understand this because they only understand the physical relation. But the reason, of course, so many marriages break up is that they never do find a higher spiritual connection and intellectual connection that involves a mutual affinity, and find they have nothing to talk about. At least that I've known that about some couples that broke up. And we can certainly talk more about this. And so he goes on. Besides the physical correlation, there's also the sex of intellect, thus affording a twofold correlation, a condition easily broken. And when the confluence of souls thus induced has been affected by long habits of intimacy, we have an example of the most complete relations of fusion that intercourse permits. It is not to be supposed then that the difficulty we find in sympathizing with some persons arises from lack of soul in them, but rather from lack of mental or physical correlation between us. Paradoxical as it may seem, the most perfect lover given us on earth is our own lover, not because of mental adaptation of his soul to ours, for the essence of all souls is one, but by reason of our mutual mental and physical adaptation, which, relaxing the mutual antagonisms of our personalities, allows the spirits to fuse. Individualities may or may not match well, but souls always match. So again, maybe some of the problems in modern marriage and family life would be solved if people knew how to match souls. And I don't know if astrology will do this, but there are clearly people that find out they're ill matched and they thought they were wonderfully matched to begin with. Okay, and just to continue further, it seems that at times the instinct of solidarity asserts itself in connection with states of physical exaltation, and sometimes independently of them. Thus, narcotics, intoxicants, and the natural stimulants of beauty, music, a soft, bland air, perfume often produce singly or unitedly a state very favorable to this psychic experience. Of course, he is not encouraging the use of drugs or alcohol here, I don't think, but there are times that people so desire the sense of unity of their soul with others in the universe that they think that an artificial stimulation, such as a drug or a drink, is going to do this. Well, it's going to give you a kind of false high, but it's not necessarily going to be a real spiritual experience, because that has got to come from above and go below and not the other way around. So I think that is the mistake that people who take drugs make. But as above intimidated, the instincts of universal solidarity also assert themselves quite independently of physical conditions, responding to direct moral appeal, to eloquence of speech or written word, or to the description of beauty or sublimity. It is this mixture of the physical and moral influences that gives its wonderful power to music combined with religious service. The beautiful solemnities and influences of nature are, however, the most constant reminders of the instinct of solidarity. So again, now he's making it into an instinct of a kind of higher instinct in us, not animal instinct. So again, now he's going to connect the spiritual and even the essential to the moral philosophy of his socialism. In the religion of solidarity is found the only rational philosophy of moral instincts. Unselfishness, self-sacrifice is the essence of morality. On the theory of ultimate individualities, unselfishness is madness. But on the theory of the dual life, in which the life of solidarity is abiding and the life of individuality transitory, unselfishness is but the sacrifice of the lesser self to the greater self. The individuality would always sacrifice other individualities to itself. But the soul of solidarity within us is equally indifferent to all individualities, having in view only the harmony of the universal life as its exigencies require, impels now the sacrifice of my individuality and now of yours. And of course, that's the essence of his Fabian socialism, which of course is unrealistic as people are as they are now, mostly selfish. But if people were unselfish, then a kind of socialist utopia he talks about and looking backward could be a reality. He said, thus it is that men are conscious first of the solidarity of the race, meaning the human race, then more dimly of that of the universe. So that's an interesting one to look at. And let's see, we'll go to the next. Okay, next. I don't know. Let me go back to the slideshow. Okay, there we go. We're almost finished. Okay, this is, the last one. Okay, he says there is a conscious solidarity of the universe toward the intuition of which we must struggle, that it may come to us not a logical abstraction, but a felt living fact. As individuals, we shall never be complete. The completest man lacks the compilation of the rest of the universe. Part then with the feeling of the externability of the universe, which, coupled with a sense of ignorance and powerlessness, is full of despair. Believe that your sympathy with infinite being, infinite extension, infinite variety is a pledge of identity. Above all, disabuse yourself of the mind of the notion that this life is essentially incomplete and preliminary in nature and destined to issue in some final state. For this notion that there's no warrant in reason or in proper interpretation of intuitions. Time is not a vestibule of eternity, but a part of it. We are now living our immortal lives when all men learn to interpret their intuitions of heaven and infinite things in the present instead of forever in the future. And so really, let's get back to where I can see you. Yeah, I see Jonathan. Where's everybody else? Did they all leave?
No,
No, okay, thanks.
No.
Yeah, I
You can
Yeah,
do
okay,
stop
yeah,
share, I think.
yeah, okay, stop share. Yeah, yeah, okay, so
Here
I
we
think
all.
we can talk about this. I don't know if you would have all picked the same that I did, but it's very clear that his 19th century prose is not always quite clearly understandable at the first reading. But the way I would summarize solidarity is that it really starts with the soul of the individual understanding that he or she is on a universal and infinite journey and a part of nature as well as the human race and a part of the whole universe. In fact, of course, it is time. They didn't even know about the galaxy. They didn't know about the Hubble universe. But anyone who has ever even looked up at the empyrean of the heavens, the Milky Way, has a realization that there is something very much greater than we are, but that we are also not separate. I know it's a custom of some African tribes to hold up a baby and say to this baby, behold the only thing greater than yourself, which of course is the heavens. Well, in a sense, it isn't greater because also the self is a very great part of this soul's journey. I
Mm.
think he's trying to say. So, although he wrote this at 24, there's some interesting facts about it. He never published it, although it's clearly his deepest ideas. He asked that it be read to him when he was about to die, which he did at 48, twice his life later. He died as a young man. And that I guess he felt he had reached his deepest insights in this essay. And I think clearly, as I said, he might be what you would call a blind Chela. If he is not a theosophist, then I think he is a disciple of the masters, but doesn't know it. Years ago, I know Raghuvan Iyer mentioned to me that he thought that there were certain writers on the planet who were blind Chelas, so that they were not fully aware of the masters or the 7th century plan or anything like that, and yet they were doing the work and that they would perhaps wake up to it later. So Bellamy seems to be one of these people, and although I mean, Fabian socialism, although favored by many intellectuals of the day, Bernard Shaw was one, H.G. Wells, uh, many prominent people uh, were involved in Fabian socialism, the whole Bloomsbury crowd later, which produced people like John Maynard Keynes, who essentially developed the equations within capitalism, which would help the terrible depression which occurred in the 1930s. But in spite of its lack of what we might call being realistic, it's still alive today, these ideas, but they will only come about with a change in human nature. And I think Bellamy realizes that he's of such a nature that he might be willing to share what he has with the whole, but most people are not. There are people who want to privatize Social Security and Medicare, and which I don't think would work. But they think these are socialist ideas, what they are. But what is good about Fabian socialism, I think, is that it does not include violence. The problem with Marx's vision, as true as it is about the plight of the worker, is that the unfortunate phrase dictatorship of the proletariat really does not provide for any kind of democracy and would lead to the violence of such people as Lenin and unfortunate things that happened, which led to the drastic failure of Soviet Marxism and others. So I don't know if you would have picked the same quotations from the essay as I did, but I thought those were the most important to share in spite of the fact that 19th century prose is a little difficult to unpack, it is very beautiful. So I wanted to read it to you. And so, what do you think about this religion of solidarity, Ben? I think it is the soul of theosophy as well. And I'd like to hear from you about it.
Judy, could I ask you a question?
Yeah.
He wrote uh, apparently at the time of social Darwinism and Herbert Spencer and so forth, the so-called synthetic philosophy, but the bottom line was selfishness, basically. And so there were those that were saying it's very natural to be selfish. Then he's putting this solidarity in the context of eros. It sounds like to me the way you presented that.
Mhm.
And what more natural thing, existentially natural than desire, right? What a countervailing message, to just say, no, this is as natural as magnetism, really. This idea. I was wondering if you could maybe say anything more about that.
Well, yeah, that's a great question. Does he put this idea of solidarity in the context of eros, and what kind of counteraction is it to the idea of social Darwinism, which really isn't adaptation, as Darwin talked about. These species survived because they were adaptable, not because they were violent or anything of this sort. Yeah, well, it's clearly an excellent counteraction to that, and of course, ideas such as social biology, which are more modern, have presented this idea that yes, everyone is selfish. Even the altruistic person is unselfish because they want people to say, oh, what a good person I am because I'm helping charity or something. Well, of course, not everyone has that motive. But clearly, he was writing in a time, I mean, the Gilded Age, there were people making an incredible amount of money in the 1890s. Like before that, Leland Stanford is the example in California, who was a ruthless robber baron. The greatest thing he did was, of course, to start a university, which became very prominent, still is, but it was actually Jane Lathrop Stanford that carried that forward. A woman alone on a male board in an era in which women couldn't even vote. And she held that university together when they all said, close it because no one wants to go here. They all go to Berkeley. Well, of course, that didn't happen. But I think in terms of a counteraction to the idea of, oh, we're all naturally selfish, which pops up all the time. In the 1960s, there was a dreadful book written called African Genesis, in which it said, we human beings are all descended from really violent apes. And so naturally, we're going to be violent and selfish and fighting with each other. And then Jane Goodall and Diane Fossey proved without a doubt that apes are not violent. They're not violent at all. It took women with patience to discover that. I think Shobja wants to make a comment, and there are a couple of chats also. But yeah, that's a great question. Shobja, did you have something to say? No?
Monica does.
Monica, okay.
And Dr. Judy, thank you for this. I thought this was really wonderful. And I thought that this article is pretty amazing. One thing that came to mind is that at least this student is not used to hearing the word solidarity regarding the universal. And I thought that was pretty amazing. But he seems to be talking about adopting a spiritual practice of seeing life this way. I mean, I know when we study the teachings and we study theosophy, you know, the idea of impersonality is constantly put before us. But he seems to be saying there's an intentional way of operating that gives, that lifts us out of the personal, and not only out of the personal, but out of the individual, which was also really surprising. And there were a couple of things that I copied from the article. One that he talks about how to go about doing this. And he says, be not careful of your goings and doings. Be not deluded into magnifying their importance. And this was my favorite sentence from the whole thing. He says, live with a certain calm abandon, a serene and generous recklessness.
Mm.
I thought that was pretty amazing.
Yeah, sometimes it's called the higher carelessness. I mean, why are we so concerned about little things that happen, you know, spilled milk, or the car breaks down, or something of this sort? It really isn't anything ultimately important. And yeah, I think obviously some people would find key passages in the essay that I didn't hook into, but I hooked into what I thought was the essence of the argument about solidarity. And I think it is, I mean, we think of matter in a material life as really being solid, but matter is in an extreme flux. I mean, matter is something that doesn't last very long at all, like our physical bodies, but our souls are ultimately much more solid and much greater, and they will last infinitely. I mean, the body will die, but the soul never does. And he seems to just know all this intuitively, as Emerson did. And of course, he gets it clearly. I think he's very familiar with the New England transcendentalism. It reminds me a lot of Whitman. But I think what he says about the personal human relations between people and how they are also the beginning of the soul of solidarity is very important, because some people who get so disappointed by their personal life, you know, just get soured on all of life, and that is really so wrong and so disastrous. And unfortunately, it happens. I think there are other questions.
Hey, Luca.
Thank-
Looks like, is
Yeah.
that Luca? Yeah.
Luca? Maluka? You have a question? Maluka?
Sorry, I was putting my dog outside. I was parking. Sorry. It was lovely. It's always a wealth of information, so informative. And you mentioned the theosophical movement for some, the universal brotherhood. It seems like that was mentioned a few times. And in 5 Messages, HPB talks about altruism is a keynote of theosophy and the cure of all ills. I was wondering, how do we do that? Cure all ills through brotherhood.
How do we cure all ills? I mean, through altruism. I mean, the difficulty is that, you know, people will say cynically, well, you can't change human nature, but that is exactly what theosophy purports to do, is alter the buddhimanas of the race, the whole human race, so that we would immediately say, oh my goodness, I can't be partying tonight. Brothers are suffering. People are without food. Animals are suffering. You know, we've got to immediately go help these people. Well, no, you know, we're out partying. You know, we're out drinking, having a good time. It's 4th of July. Let's set off our fireworks and not worry about how many birds we kill. and or whether we set things on fire or not. And it's clear that it's going to be a long, slow process in which people will be willing to sacrifice something of themselves to help others. I mean, there are many, many charities for different groups who are suffering, and for animals, for the environment. And I have given to these. I am absolutely overwhelmed with requests to the point where I've had to cut down on it. But I think there has been progress in some ways in 100 years plus. I mean, we do have Medicare, we do have Social Security, and we do have these programs the government has set up, yet there are those who would like to get rid of them. And unfortunately, yeah, they are large enough in number that it is a threat. And even, we know that fascism is still a real threat in this country, in this world, with a small country like Ukraine being invaded by Russia because the borders have gone back and forth. And of course, they would tell us, well, we've got no right to talk. We invaded Iraq, Afghanistan, and we took over the whole United States as we are considered an empire in Europe. We extend from the Virgin Islands to Guam, and so from Alaska to Brownsville, Texas. And we're considered an empire. So it's very hard for us to get very self-righteous when we've been pretty selfish ourselves. But gradually, if you think in the long terms of the soul's development, then clearly Bellamy is right, and eventually utopia will come about. It may not be until much further into the sixth race. I mean, he writes in one of his stories about a man who lands in accidentally on an island where everyone is psychic. I mean, they have become an advanced race, and he doesn't understand why none of these people can talk. And excuse me. Yeah, thank you. I just thank you, the person that's taken care of me today. And he realizes they're a totally psychic race, and they're totally benevolent and kind. But of course, he doesn't fit in there because he doesn't know how to communicate psychically. Well, they can't lie to each other anymore. And eventually this may happen with human beings, that we will no longer have to use the medium of speech in different languages and be so separate from each other. But at the moment we are. So the other question.
We've got Jeff from Japan, and then David.
Greetings to everybody in the American Empire. Yeah, Judy, what you just said about, like reading each other's minds. When I was young, I traveled with the Yamabushi, which HPB talks about. And I never had to ask him a question directly. As soon as I thought the question, he would answer. And we were just the two of us. So, it wasn't like he was showing off to people and stuff. And it was a strange feeling because I couldn't hide anything. Sometimes I think, oh, this old geezer or something like that. And everything would register. So it's funny. You feel a sort of relaxation. And you realize how much in our normal relationships we put on, or we say something that we don't really mean, or whatever, or we're not expressing anyway what we're thinking. But I was interested in this phrase of being equally indifferent to all individualities. And I think that this is sort of, it's an ideal if we're talking about ultimate love of the God with all your heart and all your mind. That's what it's about. It's going beyond all individualities. But in the Mahatma letters, I think it was Master KH said that the really noble, heroic things that people do are usually for their religion, for their country, for their family. If you're talking about self-sacrifice, you're not making a self-sacrifice for all of humanity. I mean, generally speaking, that's, I think must be really rare. Maybe somebody like Maria Curie, who gave, her life really for the advancement of science would fit into that category. But I'm wondering if partly, and also I really like what Jonathan had to say about love. I mean, it is love, and love always involves thinking about the other person first. But right? I mean, you're thinking about that person's good before thinking about me. I think that's an instinctive thing in love. And I just don't see how you can really take the individual out of the picture, individualities out of the picture, and have it work. I think as an abstract ideal, it's all very fine. But in real life, when we love somebody, and that's a person, and that's a person with an individuality or a group of people. So I'm wondering if this is sort of a like an Achilles heel for Fabian socialism, with this idea of complete universalism and those sort of ideals, which I see, like Brexit, although I don't know, I probably wouldn't have voted for Brexit, but if I was British, but I can see why so many people were for it, because again, it's just going to this, well, that's the universal. Complete globalization has become something which talks about universal, and it isn't really universal. It's serving the 0.0001%, basically. But anyway, I'm sort of seeing that. I'm wondering how well, it's amazing. I mean, what he's writing is amazing, but I'm seeing as a social project whether this can really work. And I don't see it just as a limitation of people being selfish, but that our unselfishness does involve individuals, does involve our family members and our groups and all of that kind of stuff. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Okay, well, this is very complex, and maybe some others can answer it better than I can, but he does talk about the family life that eventually it will evolve. If I think by individuality, he's really talking about the personality. And if people really love each other in the family, they are going to put up with each other's little idiosyncrasies the same way. If you're married to another person, or if you're deeply in love with another person, and you really experience what Plato calls eros, or the wise Diotima teaches him at the end of the symposium, that love is of the soul, then that individuality that you thought was so important, the me, the I, will kind of dissolve into a greater life. I mean, if you're a parent, you have a child, that child can become more important than anything else to you. I've never been a parent myself directly, but I can see how that would be. But it's clear, unless the whole or most of the society changes its narcissism. We know there are extreme narcissists we have among us, what we might even call sociopaths, where nobody but me is important at all. And of course, these are very bad people to get involved with because they understand nothing beyond themselves. But I think what he means by individuality is their personality. But of course, we could also talk about the greater individuality of the soul, which is its own separate, distinct monad. And if it can connect with another monad in a divine way, then of course there's going to be a kind of eternal love. I mean, you might read the poem by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, of what she said to Robert Browning in her sonnet 43, because I think it's so powerful, and it's so much of what I think Bellamy is trying to say about the personal sexual relation, which clearly they had. I mean, he rescued her from a very neurotic household in which she had an overbearing father who was trying to keep her prisoner. You know, and she says, "I love you to the breadth and depth and height my soul can reach, all feeling out of sight, beyond all speech."
Mm.
And then at the end of the sonnet, she says, "And if the gods doth will it, I shall but love thee better after death." So she's sort of gone beyond the personal love for Browning. But in terms of the, applying the kind of personal love we can have for each other, which is self-sacrificing, or, there are plenty of soldiers that have been willing to sacrifice for their country in a very courageous way, even if the country is wrong. If we could apply that to the whole of the human race, then we would get somewhere. But I think your skepticism is reasonable, because we are away from there yet. And until we get rid of some of the horrible narcissism, which has led to the gun-toting people, we're in a lot of trouble, and we're a long way from any kind of socialism that Bellamy is advocating. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of people who thought he was just a crazy nut during the Gilded Age. There, and I think David Grossman wants to say something.
Well, you've covered a lot there. So where I started to want to say something, I'm sort of somewhere else now. But Bellamy, in looking backward, he has some solutions for some of this with the greed and money. He, as I remember, anyway, it's been a while since I read it. A person who's highly educated and has the good fortune to help others, like a doctor, that's sort of his payment. While the person who's, the garbage collector actually gets paid more money than the doctor. So the whole money kind of, psychology of it is totally taken out of things. And there's a whole different level of measuring success and things like that. So that was one point I thought Bellamy brings out so well in looking backward. Just one other quick thought I had about this whole idea of solidarity. It's interesting, in the 1980s, we talk about communism. The Polish Union that did a lot to break the communist hold at that time was called Solidarność. Solidarity. It was the solidarity movement. And they got together, through common interest. Obviously, that's part of what solidarity is, I think, no? We get together based on common interest. And I think that's what theosophy has to offer us, this higher sort of common interest than we usually think of, that we're all on this journey, this evolving path together. And if we looked at life from that standpoint, there'd be a lot more solidarity rather than competition, as you were pointing out, and worse. So that's it.
Well, yes, I remember talking about looking backward 30 years ago, and indeed, we've got to eliminate the idea of competition, which is so ingrained in education. I mean, I can remember being in the Palo Alto school system as a child, and just constantly taught you've got to be better than the next guy. And, this led to cheating and a lot of a great distress over IQs and other nonsense that went on. But, and until I think the Buddhimanas of the race evolves, and I mean, it is evolving in spite of all the travail we're going through. I mean, Kali Yuga is moving very, very fast. And the worst thing we could do would be to give up. But I think what is so powerful about Bellamy is that it does start with the individual really willing to give up the personal ego in the Buddhist sense and not to desire for the self, but of course to desire the good of the whole. But this doesn't mean that you want to become a pauper for the sake of society, but that you want to train yourself. So motive, I think, has everything to do with it. Do we teach so that we can win an award for our teaching, or do we teach that students can learn? Do we become a politician to serve, or do we become a politician to become rich and powerful? So we know the distinction here, and we have to work on it. But I think Bellamy is an eternal optimist, and perhaps outrageously so, in by our terms in our society at the present.
Well,
Thank you. There must be other questions or comments.
any other questions or comments? Technically, our meeting time is over, but we always kind of fudge that a little bit, so.
Yeah, I mean, there are others who may have picked out a lot of different passages in the essay that I did, but I think his prose is really very beautiful once you get into it, and it's worth reading many times.
I'm really glad that you kind of recommended that we kind of do some homework, so to speak, and kind of get prepared for this. That was such a good idea. It kind of gives me the idea maybe we should do that more often in the future, that speakers kind of recommend something and we kind of send that out with the invite. So.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me, giving me the chance to talk about this amazing writer. So I've really enjoyed this series.
Thank you. There is one thing that occurred to me about this idea of the individual of love and eros and so forth, that occurred to me from a Buddhist thinker, Matthieu Ricard. I don't know who's heard of Matthieu Ricard. He's a French geneticist who in the 60s got his PhD in genetics and biology and so forth. But he got hooked up with Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism, and he went and studied in Nepal for 35 years and just learned to become a great meditator. And then he cycled back around in his life and became a participant in a lot of experiments with neuroplasticity, and at the University of Wisconsin. And he and several meditators that were recommended by the Dalai Lama would participate in these experiments on meditation, where that they could actually record scientifically. And these were called adept meditators. Actually, that's actually the word that the Dalai Lama described them with. And he was at Matthieu Ricard was asked, well, what do you guys meditate on? And he said, well, we try and focus on something called non-referential compassion. Non-referential compassion. And well, what's that? It's first you start off with, you try to imagine the unconditional love of a mother for her child. Absolutely unconditional. So you start there with, in other words, I like love with an object, you could say, to kind of tap into HPB's article, love, I think, without an object. But basically, then he says from there, within the same current of unconditionality, you begin to expand that circle of love to a wider group of people, maybe to the whole family, to your friends, to your community, and finally to the whole world. But slowly and deliberately. And these are, people who have been meditating all their lives, so they have a lot of control in this area, but it's kind of a heart expansion in that way. So it's just an interesting take on that, where you start with the individuality and then you transform it and you go from there. So just an interesting take on that. So
I think this gentleman Ricard was also associated with Thich Nhat Hanh.
yes.
He was in France. Yes. Well, that's a great comment, great application. I think the Dalai Lama meditates 4 hours a day for the betterment of humanity. And I know that this is a great point in seeing action and inaction and inaction and action. Because people who think that meditators aren't doing anything are so foolish because they are involved in this constant bustle of samsara, which he talks about in the little short story he wrote called The Blind Man's World, who ran into this race of psychics. And when this fellow finally gets back on a cruise ship, he gets rescued. He gets wrecked again in a boat. He simply can't stand the people on the ship who are all just chattering and gossiping and thinking about their own pleasures and doing nothing. And he's very happy when he gets a terminal diagnosis and gives the captain his manuscript. And he said, nobody's going to believe this, but please publish it. And, that is quite true. The more meditators we have, probably the more the race mind is going to improve and really look at people from the point of view of the soul. And it's like in the family relation or the marital relation, or if you look at the other person as a soul struggling side by side with you and a divine entity, you look at a person in a lot differently than in just someone that you want to please you. And of course, the narcissist is the person who wants to be pleased and doesn't really care about you. And unfortunately, there are enough of them around. And if you have to feel very sorry for them, but they do cause quite a bit of trouble.
Well, your comment about action and inaction, and inaction and action, I see Shobha smiling, is a wonderful segue into it's an opportunity for me to announce that next week we will be hearing about the self-governed sage, and where Arjuna wants to know what a Muni is like, what a sage is like. So we're very much looking forward to that. It will be Shobha. I'll leak that information, and we're very much looking forward. So, gosh, thank you, Judy, so much. We really got some deep insight. I learned so much.
Well, thank
Thank you,
It's-
Judy. Thank you. That was lovely.
Thank you. Well, it's a
Arigato,
privilege
Judy.
to be here and discuss this with all of you.
Mhm.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, for your
Thank
help.
you,
too.
Judy.
Thank you.
Okay.
Judy.
All right.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Happy
Judy.
4th of July.
Okay.
yeah.
Everybody,
Yes,
Yeah.
everybody.
Jonathan.
Happy Interdependence Day.
Interdependence Day.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Okay, everybody. All right. Good night.
Take
Thank you,
care,
John.
Bob.
Good night.
Heard your-
Okay.
Namaste.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Namaste. Love you all.
Namaste.